Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for continuing to be a part of this conversation. I want to remind everyone that live captioning is available. You can press the button at the bottom of your screen, and that this session will be recorded for future viewing. We'll be sending out more information about that at the close of the symposium. We ask that all of the audience members please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, although we also want to remind you that we will not have time to answer all of your questions, but we are going to do our very best to address as many as possible. I want to thank one of our graduate students in the program of Museum Studies here at Syracuse University, Aisha Pierre, for her help in the background moderating this discussion. Also, in the interest of time, I want to remind you that we've decided to forego our full introductions of each panelist. If you want to find more information out about the panelists on this session and any other session, please visit the website or go to your program for more information. I'm very excited to introduce session 4, What Does Diversifying the Collection Mean to Artists? Moderated by the illustrious Carrie Weems. Through image and text, film and performance, and her many convenings with individuals across a multitude of disciplines, Carrie Weems has created a complex body of work that centers on her overarching commitment to helping us better understand our present moment by examining our collective past. Welcome, Carrie. You are muted, Carrie.
I think I'm on.
There we go.
I'm here. So hello and welcome. It's great to see you, and thanks to the Everson. I think that now all of the panelists can turn on their cameras and their cameras. So thanks to the Everson, and thank you so much, Andrew, for inviting us here today. Of course, I've been thinking about the questions around diversity probably most of my life. It is not a new concern. It is not a new issue. It did not happen yesterday. It has been the way that I've lived my life, and it's been really at the core of my life and the core of my work. In 2006, I began standing in front of museums, and I went on to stand in front of museums around the world, in London, Paris, Berlin, Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, the centers of Western power. I think in a way I was using my body as a witness, as a reference point, representing and standing in for that which had long been denied, historically denied, a woman with little access and with little power, but a participant and a non-observer at the same time. In 2014, I became the first African-American. In 2014, I became the first African-American. In 2014, I became the first African-American to be given a solo retrospective at the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. The first in 2014. It's pretty shocking. But as a part of that exhibition, of that retrospective, I decided that I really wanted to stage a 5-day convening. A gathering of tremendous artists, writers, public intellectuals, dancers, musicians, critics, museum directors, to really investigate and to interrogate what contemporary artists of diverse backgrounds were actually making and doing at that very moment, the kinds of questions that they were raising, the kind of thoughts that they were having. And I presented it really in the context of the museum at the Guggenheim, because I thought that the museum really needed to understand firsthand and in a full way the meaning of diversity. And that one simply needed to look about one's community and one's neighborhood in order to understand what was going on, that the museum needed to diversify was clear, was obvious, and of course it's been contested for a number of years now, or more recently, I should say. And so in part, I think that this talk today is really important because I think that it really is a time, a new time to think about the ways in which museums are operating, the kinds of questions that we have about museums and their roles. And so with that, I simply want to introduce this extraordinary panel that we have with us today: Wendy Red Star, Mokgosi, Deborah Kass, and Amalia Mesa-Bains, tremendous artists. And we're going to hear from them basically in that order. We're going to start with Wendy, we'll go to Meleko, and then we'll go with Deborah, and Amalia will close the session. And of course, we'll come back with question and answer. And so now I'll turn you over to Wendy Red Star.
Thank you, Carrie. And it's an honor to be here and an honor to be with everyone tuning in. I'll go ahead and show the first image. I specifically wanted to talk about a project that just recently got installed at the end of January at the Jocelyn Art Museum. It's titled the Indian Congress. And we can go to the next slide. So the Jocelyn Art Museum is in Omaha, Nebraska, and there is a photographer there named Frank Reinhardt. But besides that, there was an amazing gathering of over 500 Native people called the Indian Congress, which happened in correlation with the Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition. And it was this gathering of over 30 different Native tribes that came together, including my own, which is Apsalaga, that I became really interested in. And part of that was because of Frank Reinhardt. We can go to the next image. This is Frank Reinhardt, and there's also a painting of Napoleon. I got a kick out of Frank Reinhardt dressing up as Napoleon for a masquerade. It kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of maybe a sense of humor that he had. I'm always interested in who's behind the camera photographing Indigenous people. What was exceptional about Frank Reinhardt was that he recorded most of the names of the individual sitters and most of the and the tribal affiliations. So I want to talk a little bit about the Trans-Mississippi Exposition that happened in 1898. So here is an image of what that exposition looked like and a map. And then as part of this exposition, there was an Indian encampment. And Frank photographed all of the Native people there. We can go to the next image. Here is some of the prints. We can go ahead and advance. So I became really interested in these images. They're striking, they're beautiful. There's profiles, there's full-length portraits, and then there's some field photography too. And I had access to this collection in the next slide through the, this is my community. We can keep going past this one. Through the Omaha Public Library, they have a large collection of Frank Reinhardt's photos of the Indian Congress. And I became very interested in seeing all of these images. And when I was offered the opportunity to have a solo exhibition there, that's what I wanted to focus on. I wanted to have that experience of bring together the Indian Congress and the magnitude of the Indian Congress by utilizing Frank's images. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Go ahead and advance. And so this is, investigating some of the ways in which the booths were utilized to display sort of the different ingenuities at the time became very interesting to me. We can go to the next. Specifically, these fruit stands that show the produce. And really, Omaha was trying to say like how they were advancing in technology, and the Native people sort of represented sort of the death of the old ways. And I wanted to bring those two ideas together. So let's go ahead and go to the next one. So using those sort of fruit stand displays, I cut out every single image I could find of the Indian Congress and reunited these over 35 different Native nations. We can go ahead and go to the next. So another kind of amazing thing that happened was Frank actually went to my reservation a year later and photographed about 2 miles away from where I grew up. So this is a photo of Frank's on the left and a photo of my dad pointing to the very area that Frank photographed. We can go to the next. And go ahead and go to the next. And go ahead and go to the next. And so this is my daughter, exactly where I grew up. And the photo on the right is of a man named Bird all over the ground. And so I wanted to combine sort of these two lines through Frank's photography that connected me to Omaha. And we'll go ahead and play the last video here to close out. So that is the Indian Congress. And I would love to thank Annika Johnson, the curator, and the very supportive exhibition team at the Joslin Art Museum for helping me to bring this project to reality.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you very much. Wonderful. I have so many questions for you. I'm really looking forward to time, and I'm hoping that we'll do this sooner rather than later, where we can gather again probably for more than an hour and 10 minutes to really have a deep conversation about the work that we're doing and the meaning of this work in this time. Next, we'll go to Meleko.
Thank you, Carrie. And I wanted to second Wendy's, sentiment that I'm really grateful and humbled to kind of be in everyone's presence here. So I'll read a bit. Is my slide going? My slides are not. So we can stay on the first slide for a bit. So I'll read, and because I'm not so good at talking offhand, just to keep myself on track. So sharing is caring. So anyone who has interacted with a full or 5-year-old knows about this simple ethical lesson around the equitable distribution of something, right? If you possess a larger share of something, then you are obligated to share it when necessary or when called upon. Sharing is caring. I think this rule applies to our conversation here, and I hope you will allow me to stretch this lesson into this context, and somehow this will make sense. But if not, my apologies. Go to the next slide. So I would like to mention, we can stay on this for a second, that the images here do not directly correspond to what I will be saying. So the images are basically projects that I've done. And while most of my work is invested in expanding the frame of reference around figurative painting, post-colonial aesthetics and histories, decolonizing strategies in the proper sense of thinking about equity and equality in relation to colonial histories and notions of indigeneity, my work does not directly deal with deaccessioning, if I'm pronouncing that word right. I've been trying to figure out how to pronounce this word, but English is my second language, so you'll forgive me. But perhaps showing my work will give you more insight in terms of how I approach the image and the institutional space that it occupies. So I think from here we can just go through the images, not that quickly, but I don't have that many images. The conversation around deaccessioning has mainly happened within the context of Western institutions, more so in relation to Western art objects in their possession, with the aim of relinquishing those objects for monetary value. Deaccessioning of state-owned art of othered cultures, on the other hand, is discussed in terms of restitution. For example, the restitution of African art objects was dominant throughout 2017, 2018, and obviously before that. In France, for example, the Savoir-Sa report called for the state to rethink the inalienability law, which prohibits national institutions from deaccessioning anything in a public collection. In this case, we see a complex of laws. One, the laws that were in place during colonial periods that did not prohibit the state from pillaging and taking these African art objects away and importing them to France. Two, laws that prohibit the deaccessioning of these objects. And three, the laws that are now required or needed to allow deaccessioning and therefore returning these objects to their rightful owners. I should say that the emphasis, and here when we're talking about diversifying the collection and deaccessioning, the emphasis is on two things: to correct injustice and to also share both aesthetic objects and discursive space. As a painter, I'm not qualified to speak on any of this, but I would like to give a perspective on the last element here, which is what I believe the conversation around deaccessioning and diversifying the collection is about, right? Sharing the discursive space. Again, sharing is caring. We can all agree that the field of art, as we understand it, is dominated by Anglo-European forms of thinking, tools of analysis, academic training, strategies of collection and display, and so forth. Much like any field or discipline, it is a discourse. It is widely noted, we can keep moving with the images. It is widely noted that Michel Foucault used the term discourse to refer to a historically contingent social and epistemological system that produces knowledge and meaning. He proposes that discourse creates, and I quote, practices that systematically form the objects of which they speak. The ramifications of any discourse are primarily material and systemic, with the aim of organizing specific and general bodies of knowledge that structure social relations. Discourse, or a set of institutionalized rules of engagement, is concerned with power relations between subjects. The fact that discourse is necessitated by a set of rules means that it is first and foremost exclusionary. Not everyone is invited. It is not an unconditionally shared space. Therefore, the field of art is not a shared space. Who it represents is biased. In order to make it a shared space or an unbiased space as much as we can, therefore, there would need to be a whole-scale relinquishing of power and capital. American and European public institutions would need to deaccession looted African art objects and return them. Likewise, these same institutions, I think the images are kind of going a bit too quickly, but never mind. Likewise, these same institutions would need to open themselves up, provide recompense for those that have otherwise been excluded from the discourse since its inception. This has to take many forms, and one of those is deaccessioning objects in their collections to make way for others, to make room. After all, there's only a limited number of space at the table. Understandably, relinquishing power and capital is a difficult task. And this is evident from how these institutions are unable to let go of objects that they believe are of incredible value to them. But what about objects that are of equal value to other histories and cultures that are yet to be recognized to count as such? The idea that an artwork is too valuable to let go, and therefore there is no other artwork of equal value that can take its place, points to a very big problem. And that is the system that is used to attribute both economic and discursive value to an object. Therefore, it is this very discourse that has to be undone. There is a finite amount of space available, and there is no other choice but to share this space. To refuse to do so, to share this discursive space, clearly communicates that these are institutions that are not concerned with caring for others, but only have in their interest reproducing systems of inequity and valuing discourse that only benefits them. So that's pretty much, I can't talk about my work because then would be for a very long time, but those are kind of some of my thoughts around that. So I'll end it there.
Meleko, thank you very much. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on with the slides. I don't know why presenting them in an orderly fashion is not happening. We are, after all, visual people. We should be able to run a slideshow. So get it together on somebody's end. I think that this is really important. And I'm sure that Meleko spent some time putting together his presentation and would like to have his work seen properly. And the same would be true for Deborah and for Amalia. Thank you for raising this critical issue, because I think that I've been thinking about deaccessioning very much in the same way. What are the questions and the problems that circulate around it in a deeper way than simply around diversifying the collection, what diversity means to me, right? I mean, that's a little simple. This is a much more sort of complex reading. And as far as I know, our great friend, Okui and Wurzer, really believe that essentially that the contemporary museum is really not functioning, that the contemporary museum, you know, the way in which it's been constructed or based on the pillars of its construction really actually needs to be dismantled. And for that reason, he decided that all of his work would actually not be in the center of the West, but would be actually moved to Asia, which is where actually all of his work will be seen in the future. So I hope to get back to this conversation more. I think it's really important that you've brought it up. And I think that I want to open that up, this question, to the larger group. And now we're going to go to Deborah Katz, and I'm assuming that we're all already on the technical side. Deborah Katz.
Sorry, Carrie, we are having some technical issues back here. Just one moment, I apologize.
Can you hear me now? Okay, are we good? Yeah.
I think we're ready, Deb.
Okay, good. Thanks, Carrie, again, for inviting me to be part of this important symposium and to specifically address diversifying the museum on this distinguished panel. I'm going to do a little historical stuff. I'm a little kid on a trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, driving in from the suburbs with my father. As always, we visit the armor, the Egyptian rooms, and wander around upstairs to look at the paintings. For the first time, I'm stopped in my tracks by a painting. It's an image of a woman. Slide. Is it up? You guys see a slide?
Just hold on, Deb, let them get it together. Don't be rushed.
Okay, I got to find my text though. Okay, hold on. You guys, my text has disappeared. Can I get out of full screen?
Just go to escape, Deborah.
Yeah, no, I'm hitting, there we go. Okay. I'm reclaiming 30 seconds, Carrie. Only kidding. Okay, all right, so we're going around the museum. For the first time, I'm stopped in my tracks by a painting. It's an image of a woman. She looks completely different than the other ladies hanging on the walls. She looks like a real person, like people I know, like the Jewish immigrant grandmas of my world, heavy set, solid, and like both of my grandmas, this lady has gravitas. I'm having, as Michael Brinson labeled it, my first experience of aesthetic emotion, based on something he had not considered, identification. For the first time in a museum, I'm seeing someone who looks like people I know, and I am mesmerized. Okay, good. Fast forward. I'm an ambitious teenage artist. I babysit to pay for lessons at the Art Students League in New York City, where I draw from life on Saturday mornings. Since I intend to become a modern artist, I haunt the Museum of Modern Art in the afternoons, looking for information about this weird ambition. What is an artist? How do I become one? I spend countless afternoons prowling the galleries, wondering what these modern paintings mean. And to figure out, I voraciously read books from the bookstore that I don't understand. I like the Rothkos and de Koonings, but the first artist I might actually get is Oldenburg because he's funny. So I read about pop art, Rauschenberg, Johns, and Warhol. I fall deeply in love with all of them, since they're talking about something I recognize, if not understand, the real world. Despite my reading and thinking and looking around MoMA, the temple of my aspiration, my reflection is nowhere to be found. I couldn't help but wonder, what does this art have to do with me? Little did I know when I was 15 in 1967 that this would be the subject of my adult work, and also the work of artists, intellectuals, historians, and academics across fields and disciplines for the next 45 years, creating a context for my thinking and the structural political shift that brings us right to the dilemma facing museums, politics, and all cultural enterprises now, the reckoning. When I moved to New York City in my early 20s and the mid 70s, second wave feminism was in full force. Bella Abzug, Gloria Steinem, Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, Flo Kennedy, and Ms. Magazine held center stage. Women had enormous political power for the first time, and with it came cultural power. It was an inflection point not unlike the one right now, with some similarities, including the promise of equality and justice. Linda Nochlin wrote Why Are There No Great Women Artists in 1971 and destroyed the traditional androcentric frame of history. In 76, she and Anne Sutherland Harris organized women artists 1550 to 1950 at LACMA. Then it traveled to the Brooklyn Museum to the delight and edification of women artists everywhere. In Soho, the new art district, women painters were showing in the newly opened galleries. Elizabeth Murray, Mary Hallman, Faith Ringgold, Joan Snyder, Howardina Pindell, Pat Steer. I was in my early 20s, waitressing and living my dream exactly where I wanted to be, downtown at the intersection of New York school painting and feminism. Surrounded by the work of female giants and their disruptive interventions into abstraction and history, for the first time I found my female influences. For an ambitious 20-something woman painter, the future looked very bright indeed. In 1980, everything changed with Ronald Reagan, starting with the tax structure. The rich got really, really rich very fast when tax burdens shifted from the rich to the middle class. Suddenly, new money flooded the art world, which changed forever, becoming the unregulated art market of today. White men made the money, of course, and museums followed the money. Around this time, major museum leadership also shifted to a younger generation, mine, all white, 99% male. The 80s brought wave after wave of young male art stars, besides Basquiat, all white. They made paintings of their ambition, adolescence, and ennui. The young museum curators and directors could not get enough of male whiteness, or white maleness, if you will. Their mid-career retrospectives were quickly organized. This pleased museum trustees, masters of the universe, who invested in the young art stars who drove the same cars, smoked the same cigars, lived in the same zip codes, in whom they saw their own hipper reflections. Just as women were getting started, power shifted decisively to white men. The backlash was profoundly shocking. Its embrace, a confounding betrayal. Systemic racism and sexism were back with a vengeance in my own 60s supposedly progressive generation. The Guerrilla Girls started broadcasting our collective rage and fury in 1985. In a parallel universe, at the market margins, conceptual feminist photography and performance, theory and appropriation took aim at this astonishingly retrogressive narrative. Now looking back at the 80s, we see it was not those guys who made history, but Cindy Sherman, Adrian Piper, Barbara Kruger, our very own Carrie Mae Weems, and Sherry Levine, who became my first serious influences, my second serious influences. Along with these artists throughout the 80s, the supercharged beginnings of feminist literary criticism, critical race theory, postmodernism, multiculturalism, post-colonial queer theory, and more were creating radically disruptive narratives at an astonishing pace. I couldn't read fast enough. This, I understood, was the work of representation. It was positively thrilling. The canon of white male authority, the primacy of white male subjectivity in master narratives was being challenged everywhere across the intellectual landscape, except in painting. So I asked myself, how are power and value, slide please. How are power and value, whoops, I lost me again. Okay, hold on, escape. How are power and value created within the languages of painting? How do I paint my own subjectivity? After a decade of macho caricatures, can painting even do that? Next slide. In 1989, I began a series called The Art History Paintings in this context, a response to the complete lack of painting by women in the 80s art world as an intervention into the history of modern art, informed by the incredibly empowering cultural theory that was challenging and deconstructing white male supremacy. Next slide. Thank you. Deploying recognizable styles from the male modern masters I fell in love with at the Met and MoMA as a teenager and the pop culture I lived in, I created a different narrative. Next slide. Next slide, please. Over the next 30 plus years, I explored a range of strategies and styles to ask, where do I see my reflection? How do I paint my presence into a language that has excluded me? Next slide. Great. Since then, the same questions have been posed by new generations of young artists and curators from more and more diverse backgrounds. Their creative interrogations of the self, community, visuality, and history resonate with people who were never the museum's intended audiences, and those of us who've been doing the work for decades. In representing themselves, they may possibly change the world, and we say hallelujah. The intransigence of museums has been almost impossible to overcome until now. Demographics have brought us to this tipping point. The weight of changing demographics is forcing these fundamentally conservative institutions to face their role in representing, reproducing, and enforcing colonialism and white male supremacy. The structural problem facing them is that they are embedded in the museum's DNA and mission since inception. Democracy was never, ever the work of museums, but the times demand a new purpose, a new generation, new audiences, supported by a new president and vice president who are putting social justice and equality front and center in all public policy. And again, with political power comes cultural power. Next slide, please. The long overdue reckoning is this: can we as a country in every institution, especially those devoted to the past, finally become a true reflection of who and what we already are, a complex, diverse democracy? Are museums structurally capable of living up to the American promise of e pluribus unum, out of many, one? The jury is out. Here's what diversifying the museum means to artists. In a word, opportunity. This is what democracy looks like. Each of these works I'm going to show, and I'm showing right now, was originally conceived as a temporary installation. Once on site, they were so popular with neighbors, the community, and visitors that funds were raised to make them permanent. As a result, for the first time, there is art by women permanently installed in front of major museums, plural. This is what you get when institutions open up opportunity to all. You get new narratives and new art. You get female excellence in front of major museums. You get success. And it simply never, ever, ever could have happened till right now.
Bravo, wonderful, wonderful talk, Deb. Thank you so much. So many things to unpack, but the simplest is that it's now and that change is possible.
Mhm.
It takes an understanding and an awareness and a deep participation if change is to actually happen. This is a really wonderful talk. I'm hoping that we'll be able to come back to you, and I'm sure that there are going to be a number of questions for you in the question and answer. And now, before we will bring to you Amalia Mesa-Bains.
Well, like my peers on the panel, I am very, very pleased to be here. And what I guess I'm feeling right now is being at the end, I see how each of us positions ourselves from within our ancestry or within our race or gender or class, and we look at the notion of diversifying, the notion of deaccessioning from that point. So I want to talk a little bit about how my position began and where I am now. And I think that some of the images that I'm going to show pertain very directly to the structures of the museum. So let's have the first image. For over 45 years, I have worked within the context of the sacred, of cultural history and women's work. Because I rose from a community moment of justice and struggle called the Chicano movement, I actually almost didn't have the choice. My role was called for, which was to help build the community centers. And so my work in regard to altars as an altarista meant that I was sort of the caretaker of the dead, of memory and of the past. So as I began to cross over out of community institutions into large-scale museums, I ran into a kind of wall. If I ever got there, the intention of the sacred is impossible in those spaces. We couldn't use candles. We couldn't put up pan dulce. We couldn't put out the fresh marigolds, the cempasúchil. So in the end, I kept making accommodations, and I found myself kind of in the belly of the beast. As an artist, I have to say that I think a definition was imposed on me. And that's because installation art, which came up in the 80s, and I've been working since the early 70s, was really placed on me. And it began to be described as an installation artist, which I think was just a term to qualify what I was doing because it was so foreign to them and didn't quite make sense to the larger art field. So as I moved through these processes, I began to work toward the illumination and inquiry of false histories, because as a Chicana, as a Mexican descended person, I had always lived my life. My parents were undocumented. I lived my life as a person on the edge of something, never quite belonging in either place. I wasn't born in Mexico, so I wasn't Mexican. I was born in the United States, but my parents were not citizens. So I had a kind of interstice space where I lived. And when the Chicana movement came along, I found my peers. So I began to inquire into the history of our people. And one of the first things I had to do was, it's similar to the story actually of Deborah when she encounters the image of the woman in the museum. For me, it was, I needed to have an intellectual role model. And at the time I was going through a PhD program, it was literally 1 in a million. One Mexican to get to a PhD would have to pass through, a million would drop away. You'd be the last. That was many years ago. But I began to look into the life of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, who was the first feminist in the New World and a scholar, a nun, and a musicologist. And she wrote sonnets also in Nahuatl, and she drew upon the lives of Black slaves. So she becomes one of my very early inspirations, and this is her library. Next. So I began to use the notion of inquiry as a process of investigating how our histories get reframed and, I would say, malformed over time. So Sor Juana eventually contests the church in a way that is seen as insubordinate, and she's cast out and tends to the sick and dies at 31 and is renewed by scholars and Chicanas in the 70s and 80s. This is her desk, and it's my recreation of her desk. Next. So I began to look at ways of that inquiry forms the basis of the museums, because I could not understand how they operated. And because I was doing installation, I was in the museum, sometimes as long as weeks. In residencies, it might be a month or two. So I met everybody from the guard to the president of the board, and I watched how it worked. And similar to my peers, Fred Wilson, Guillermo Gomez Peña, Pepón Osorio, it became part of the way in which I worked. Next. And so I began to look at libraries, laboratories, cabinets of curiosity, Wunderkammers, and World's Fairs, because all of those embedded in colonialism, embedded in scientific racism, projected our images into the world in a way we couldn't even recognize. This piece is from a very important and epic show called The Road to Aslan. And Aslan was, by Chicano standards, a sort of space of origin. It was really the northern part of Mexico, and it had to do with a moment of recognition. And so the road to Aslan, we thought that Aslan was mythical, but what we discovered is that LACMA had Virginia Fields and Victor Zamudio Taylor do enough research to find out that in fact such a place did exist. Northern Mexico, southwestern United States, involving all kinds of tribes exchanging sacred objects through that space. So I recreated a piece of my idea of an Aslan. And in the cabinet on the floor of it are the images in glass of what the Spanish would have found at Tenochtitlan. the Chinampas, which were the floating islands where they grew food. All of it is there, the volcanoes. Next. And so I began engaging the idea of museums, really beginning from the halls of man, and prior to that, even the cabinets, curiosities, and wunderkammers. And I started to ask myself next, how in fact these things came about. And in that process, I also looked for ways to manifest traditions of healing. And that came from a series of health challenges that I had that I needed to deal with. That image in the light box is my grandmother, Mariana. So you can see from the image that my grandmother was, as all Mexicans, mixed race. So she was part Black, part Indian, and very little Spanish. And so that has been a core part of my family history for many, many years. And this piece, which was in the Neo Kudu show, it is the piece that has to do with curanderismo, or the healing practices. So I think one of the things that I see as the challenge, that not even deaccessioning, just knowledge, is that curators of color are not present. Curators that are feminists are not enough present. So there's a sort of shallow understanding and knowledge that's applied even when they deaccession and acquire something new. They're not doing that from a position of depth and knowledge and curatorial advisement and community engagement. They're just doing it. It's dollars, it's money, it's objects. So this piece has Western medicine on the top in the curanderas bundles and the eggs that roll over your body. I was not healed in that way. My father was, and my uncles were. My grandmother was a sort of adjacent curandera, but she always knew what was wrong with you and what you would need. Next. This is a detail of that piece. And in the cabinet, I was lucky enough to get that medicine cabinet, which I just loved. And in it, I put on every shelf a layer of my family. And they're all gone now, my mother, my father, my brother, my sister. But each of them has a shelf that has to do with their practices, their health, and their ancestry and history. So it's a piece that for me is very foundational. Next. Next. This last piece is probably, I like to say it's sort of like, it's been downhill ever since, but this was a collaboration with UCLA's Fowler Museum, where they allowed me to come into their collection. It took me 2 years because in the process of it, because I had had these health challenges, I had to have a reconstructive surgery on my arm, but they gave me the 2 years and I spent a lot of time visiting there. And my husband, Richard Baines, who's African-American, traveled with me and we selected the pieces. And the cabinet is based on the concept of mestizaje in the New World. Comes together by force, by violence, by slavery, by extermination. All of us, Native people, African people, and the Spanish. But there's so few of them. There are really so many more of us. And so those forms became for me really important in how I laid out the cabinet. So the whole room is set up as a wunderkammer. Next. And so each section of the cabinet has a central caretaker figure, a guardian. And there's African on the right, colonial on the left, Mesoamerican in the middle. And then there's a blessing space in the lower part, which really has to do with my own family. So my family images are there, some of the practices that we engage in terms of the 4 directions. And then I had advisors, and Martha Vega helped me with the Afro-Caribbean material. But all of these things, with the exception of some of my objects, actually came out of their collections. Most had never been seen. And I arranged them according to my understanding of slavery, violence, redress, displacement, death, mourning, love, and desire. And so all of those make up the patterns of how the objects are organized. Next. And each cabinet of curiosity is specific to the colonial figure in the center, which is John the Baptist from the Philippines. Next. And for each of them, because I was confronted with the reality that we all know that our things, I call them our things, our objects, are taken against our will. And in the same way that Meleko's talking about deaccessioning as a way of retrieving and taking back what has been stolen, I couldn't do it in that setting. So what I did is I asked them to give me one photograph of each of the the 8 objects I selected, and I could embed them in their own real history. So the Battle of the Gods Tenochtitlan, which is Mexico City, really shows you the map of that the Spanish used, and also Coatlicue, the goddess. Next. The Mesoamerican was so much more fascinating because they most all were burial pieces or objects of daily life. And so one of the things that happens to me when I'm working is that I accrue my own knowledge and I learn. They gave me at least 20 books during the 2 years that I went there. Each time I selected from a different part of the collection, I'd get new books. And so that was, for me, probably one of the best parts of it. It was very sad to leave and painful to let go of it, and it was temporary. It doesn't exist anymore. People always ask me, well, can I go see it? And I said, no, it doesn't exist. And that has been next, one of the core aspects of the way I work for many, many years. Starting out in the Galeria de Raza, at Self-Help Graphics, at Social Public Art Resource Center. I was an ephemeral artist. I just put things out and it was over. I took them back and dismantled them. There was nothing built, nothing made. And then finally around the 90s, when I was doing the show at the Whitney, I realized that I needed to have something that could last. But I find that the fragility of the ephemeral, the momentary nature of that work is for me very powerful. It's almost like a state of grace. And if I have to, I make things that last, but generally I'd rather not. This is the print taken from the Mesoamerican cabinet. And this is the location where my grandfather came from in Jalisco, and it's one of the digs there. I also use botanical images and images from the codices where you see the people walking along the river. Next. And this is the African section. I call him my guy because he was really my favorite piece that I found. I found an earlier one and it fell off the trolley and cracked its head, and everyone went crazy because they have, you know, embedded packs of magical things in them. And the nails, of course, and I'm sure Meleko understands this far better than I do, but the idea of the nails, which is the adjudication of like conflicts or something gone wrong, and he becomes a figure of adjudication. Others are parts of divination. Others are part of violent wars and slavery. And I place my husband and my family at the bottom. Next. And I call him power, authority, and truth, because in the end of all the pieces I handled, and I didn't really handle them. That's the other thing, is you can't really touch them. So I'd have to motion to people and they would hold it, and then I would diagram where it would go. But in the process of this, I came to the realization that the entire structure of the museum is a flawed one, and I'm not sure we can rectify it. And I'm not sure the deaccessioning or protests. I think that it's like, can I say this at a museum? I think it's rotten from the inside out. And so when you're trying to fix something that's that ill, what do you do? I mean, I've been doing this for years, folks. I mean, I went through all of I sent somebody the postcards. I went through these years and years of, bitch slapping people, getting angry, doing the thing, and nothing really changed. And so I've come to the conclusion that the financial investments in a largely white collection and that enterprise is almost impossible to deconstruct. So I'm here because I love Carrie and I respect all of you, and I wanted the chance to be here, but not because I'm hopeful that diversity can really happen. Although I never stopped trying. I looked through my papers and found that the original conference that we did for the Association of American Museum Directors in '91 in Chicago, which our beloved late Marcia Tucker put together. That was an incredible gathering, you know. Skip Gates was there and Tomasi Butterfeld. Anyway, we carried on. We tried to tell them how they might diversify. And then 25 years later, they celebrated because we produced a book out of it. And I went to the panel for the 25th year anniversary celebration. It was exactly the same as the people that I saw 25 years earlier, except there were more women, but it was still very, very white. So I came to the conclusion that you can write books. I think it's money that will change it. Money and some political power, because I really don't believe that in some instances the will is not there. The one thing I learned out of that particular conference at AMD is if you want to make a change, you don't ask a 67-year-old white man who's invested his money, his life, and his reputation in one dimension of art. No, you go home and you grow your own. So I did a project called Regeneration to grow me some curators of color, and I've got about 5 of them that I keep track of. So I know it can be done. It's just that it's such a long, long road. And if you noticed in the last issue of Art News, where they did a whole thing on diversity, every single person they named at Boston Fine Arts at various places, mostly women of color, but they're given titles like belonging, diversity, inclusion. And I wonder how structural that really is in the museum. And nowhere do they talk about the curators of color that we need to have there. And I say this as a Mexicana Chicana. We are the last on the list because we're political, because we're difficult, because we're demanding. And I don't believe in my lifetime that I will ever see very many people in the early generations, you know, most of us are close to 80 now, really getting to that space. And even if we did, what difference does it make? The work we do for our own community, our own culture, our own ancestors. And if they see it, they see it. If they don't, they don't. So I'm here to be as good a sport as possible, but that's all I have to say.
So, you know, I mean, thank you, Amalia. You know how much I love you, adore you, respect you, will always support you. I know the heartbreak. I know what that feels like. I understand it. I have very similar questions. And I think that in some ways, this very panel, in some ways, is the only panel of artists out of the entire gathering over these last few days, puts us in this sort of curious position that diversity is tied to the notion of deaccessioning, that diversity is tied to the notion of a negative, not a positive. And so, right, and that this would be the panel that would do that. I also, in some ways, actually find problematic, and that I had to really sort of question. But nonetheless, we are here, and I think what we do is important. Your work is important. The work that Wendy is doing is important. Meleko's work is important. Deborah's work is important. Now, the thing that I want to ask, and because we don't have very much time, I have just a couple of questions before I turn it over to the audience, because they're questions that are there. We know what these museums are. We understand their history. We understand where they've been. We don't know where they're going. Again, as Okwi and Werzer said, my dear brother who is now gone, that museums really, the Contemporary Museum has outused its usefulness, that they really do need to be dismantled and something built in their place, something to replace them. What that replacement will look like, I don't know, but museums have not always, quote, been, and they will not always be. Something will be coming ahead. We just don't know what that future is or what that really looks like. In the meantime, we continue to work. And I wonder, I want to ask each of the panelists if you can address this, maybe just a few of you. In what context would you like your work to be viewed and understood? In what context, right? Within the context of the museum, how do you, Amalia and Wendy and Meleko, how do you, Meleko, excuse me, want to see your work actually positioned and in what context? Amalia, we'll start with you. We'll go to Wendy and then with Meleko.
Well, you know, because it's been such a long road and I started out in my community and I wandered around and came back to my community because I found in the end, my community is the place where I belong. And I have a sense of that, I don't know, shared understanding. So I'm being approached now about a retrospective because I've never had one. I've had a couple of solo shows, no retrospectives, and I've been working for 45, almost 50 years. But what I want out of it is that I want the museums who take it to have large Latino community in their region. Otherwise, it's of no use to me. It's not that I don't care what other people see in it, but I know because I taught for 20 years, 25 years, and worked in community, I know my cultural material will have meaning to them. You know, when I take down those installations, I find things in the drawers. I find Xeroxes of green cards. I find rosaries. I find bundles of herbs that people have stuck in my work. So when it gets dismantled and comes back to me, I know I have been seen and I have been understood. And that's what I want. It almost doesn't matter which museum it is. It's just a museum that would have the connectedness to whatever term we're using, Chicano, Chicanx, Latino, Latinx. I just want it to be valuable and useful to people who are in a struggle. You know, it's not beyond me that we're back at the border again. We're not talking cages, now we're just talking tents maybe. But I mean, this will never, never end. I mean, I started out my life in that space. My father was a farm worker, my mother was a maid. I know that space. And as long as I keep working, I want people from the real community, not ladies who lunch on Sundays and go to the shows. I want my people to see what I do because I do it for them. And so that's, to me, the big context.
And Wendy, can you respond to this question? You know, what is the context in which you want this work to be presented?
Yeah, I think, you know, early on, especially as a young Native artist, in showing in institutions, I was, you know, primarily placed with the Native gallery, with the historic objects. Even though, you know, I went to UCLA, studied contemporary art, or I'm shown in group exhibitions that are titled "We Are Still Here," that are all Native artists. And so that kind of really played with my head a bit. But now as I'm older, I don't really care. I really feel like that's an institution, and that if they need to bat me around in that way, it's none of my concern, because that's not what I'm interested in. I'm really interested in the history and the culture, and that's my mission. And so the context I want to be viewed, regardless of where I'm put within the institution, is with a lens of humanity. I'm really interested in connecting on a human to human level, and with empathy.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm at.
Mm-hmm. In this space, it's an interesting, Meleko, you know, in some way, this sort of the same question for you. I mean, you know, I'm thinking about it not, like, who are also some of the artists that you actually want to be in dialogue with in the presentation of your work? I mean, for instance, in this conference, we are actually very much simpatico. We are in dialogue. Our work is very much in dialogue with one another. The way in which we work, the sort of historical investigations that we are involved in. So I'm also curious about that. Meleko, can you speak to that?
Yes, thank you, Carrie. Yeah, I guess I would say both, in especially, I think it would be important to have the kind of institutions that New York has, or Paris, or London, Los Angeles, for them to be in Nairobi, in Joburg, in Gaborone, in Maputo. So I think it would be important for me to be shown within the African continent, because I think the way in which art thinks about viewership is so much about the idea of a human subject from the perspective of the West. And I think there hasn't been an accounting for different configurations of the human, right? Like, what do you make of someone, I guess I'd say like myself, who believes in psychoanalysis and witchcraft and traditional medicine and linguistics, and there's this like a messy thing, right? So I think there is a way in which we need to think about the viewer in a broader context, and not just as like this, taken for granted de facto human being who we think through like continental philosophy from Germany, basically, right? So I think it would be important for me to be seen by those people who occupy the position of being human from a different point of view, from a different philosophy, from a different experience of the world. And likewise, I would say with artists, I mean, it would be amazing to be paired with African modernists. I don't know that many African modernists. I don't know that many African artists who are working in the 1970s. Because I mean, we all know the Caravaggios, we know the Basquiats, we know. You also can't really learn anything from like Jackson Pollock. Like, which painting class have you gone to and they said, this is what you can learn from Jackson Pollock? Like, nothing. But I mean, maybe some people can. I'm kind of being facetious. But yeah, I mean, I think so. I think even like modernists from Australia, modernists from Argentina, modernists from these different places who are thinking about aesthetics in totally different ways. But I mean, even I was just.
I'm sorry, excuse me, I interrupted you. Please continue.
Oh no, I was just going to add. I mean, I'm lucky to also even share the space with people like you and K. James Marshall. I mean, I think to be in a space like that, I mean, it's like that is where I want the conversation to be, right? I don't want to be in some other space. That is the critical space that I need to be. So I'm sorry to rant on and on.
Well, before I know that we're going to be wrapping up soon. I did want to ask Deborah this question too, as I've been sort of struggling with it and the ways in which I'm really trying to break out of the silos. I can't take the silos. I don't want to live that way. And to me, the question of diversity only really comes up when your world is not diverse. I mean, it really is the hallmark of that. If you're living a diverse life, then diversity is already there. That's no longer a subject. So, so diversity is really not the thing that I'm thinking about for the most part. I'm really sort of thinking about pluralities in very different ways. And I'm thinking about context. And I'm interested in art in general, right? And I believe that if artists were actually designing this panel, designing this conference, we'd actually be having a very different kind of conversation, because artists, for the most part, are really the catalyst for change and innovation. It's not the museum directors, for the most part, that are in charge of that. But Deb, I have a question for you. I would like you to answer this question before we sign off. This idea again about the role of diversity, the role of women, and how you want your work to be understood contemporarily as we, quote, diversify the museum.
It's a huge question, Carrie, and I'm going to answer. I mean, I can't really answer except in the most provincial New York way, because that's who I am. And I see my work in context with the history of post-war painting. It's what my work has been, addressing the history of post-war painting. And how has it inscribed all of this supremacy? And how do you deconstruct it? And how do you reconstruct it? And how do you make it talk in a way it was not built to talk, which is what the museums are facing.
But I think that, also in part, it has a lot to do with how the dialogue is constructed. So that for the most part, when I go into the vast majority of museums, I'm not seeing a plurality, a diverse body of work drawn together from a number of different spheres. Very rarely are white men shown with me. Very rarely am I shown with white women.
Hello, I know. I mean, this is what we're talking about.
Silo, I think, is ridiculous, and that I think is absolutely right. That the idea that that you cannot have naturally great diversity with an all-white staff.
But Amalia's right about everything. I mean, and of course, right here is the place where Amalia, bless you, said, guess what? These institutions are probably not going to work. I mean, thank you for saying it, because they're so recalcitrant and this is so overdue. And Amalia, the thing you sent, which was so great to be reminded of, and let us please include in your list of fabulous symposiums that happened between 89 and 93, the Black Popular Culture Symposium at the Studio Museum and DIA, which was the best 3 days, incredible. And that was another time like this.
Yes.
And we've lived with 30 years where nothing changed.
Show the Right Thing at NYU. That's when I met Belle. That's how the book came about, because we sat next to each other on a panel. And it was all about bell hooks.
In 1990 or 91, I organized a panel for the Drawing Center that Belle was supposed to be on, but bailed at the last minute, called Representation and Value. What role will the languages of feminism play in the artwork of the 90s? Okay. And it was Judith Wilson and Michelle Wallace. Belle didn't show, but that's fine. Barbara Blooming, Marcia Tucker, God bless her. I'm so glad you said her name. She's one of the things I had to edit out in my harsh editing mode. Marcia, Roberta Smith, Laura Cottingham, Catherine Lord, 1991.
And so we don't have enough time. We are wrapping up this panel. It's ending right now. It's unfortunate because there's so much to say. You have 4 extraordinary people that have thought long and hard about the work that they're doing. I'm hoping that our audience has really enjoyed it. I hope that you've learned something. I hope that you are living diverse lives, and that if you're not, then you plan to, because I think that it's the natural order of things. At least I like to think so. And I'll turn it back over now to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Thank you for all the panelists. We don't have time for housekeeping, but we will see you in the next session.